All right, today we're going to talk about something you probably haven't thought much about: Quaker environmentalism. I know, right? But this is a story that goes back 350 years, starting in a simple garden and ending up, well, on a spaceship. It's a wild journey, and it all kicks off with the Quakers. So, to really get a sense of how seriously Quakers take this stuff today, just look at this statement from 2012. They're saying that fighting for a sustainable world is, and get this, as difficult and decisive as the drive to abolish slavery. Wow, I mean, think about that. They're putting the climate crisis on the exact same moral level as their historic fight against slavery. That's not just a nice sentiment, that is a massive challenge they're throwing down. So that just begs the question, right? How on earth did a faith that started back in the 1600s, long before factories, long before anyone was even thinking about carbon emissions, end up with an environmental philosophy that's so spot on for today? It's a fascinating story, so let's dig in and trace how this idea grew over time. All right, first up, we have to go all the way back to the 1650s, right to the very beginning. Because to understand where their environmental ideas come from, you first have to understand their totally radical take on what is sacred. So, the early Quakers, they made a huge break from the church at the time. They got rid of formal sacraments like communion. So if that specific bread and wine on an altar wasn't the only holy thing, then what was? And their answer was just breathtaking. They said, everything. The dirt, the water, the food you grow, the entire physical world was a holy gift. And this wasn't just some nice poetic idea. It was core to their beliefs. It meant you had to treat the world with this incredible respect. Okay, so that's a pretty big idea, right? That the whole world is sacred. But how does that actually play out in your day-to-day life? Well, for them, the answer was right there in their gardens and their farms. The word they used all the time was husbandry. Now, back in the 17th century, that just meant, taking good care of your land. But for Quakers, it was so much more. It was a spiritual metaphor. Taking care of the soil was like taking care of your soul. A healthy, well-tended farm was a sign of a healthy, well-tended spirit. It connected their everyday work directly to their faith. Pretty cool, huh? And this wasn't just some personal philosophy either. It actually became public policy. Take William Penn's holy experiment in Pennsylvania. He designed Philadelphia to be a green country town. He literally planned for public parks and made sure every single house had space for a garden. And what's really amazing is he passed one of America's very first conservation laws, saying that for every 5 acres of forest you clear, you have to preserve 1. This was husbandry on a massive city planning scale. Okay, let's jump forward to the 1700s, because this is where the idea gets even bigger. A guy named John Woolman comes along, and he's an absolute visionary. He takes this idea of caring for your little patch of land and applies it to the entire global economy. Woolman's big idea was a concept he called cumber. It's a great word. It basically means all the unnecessary stuff, the luxuries and possessions that just clutter up our lives. But here's the brilliant part. He said this cumber wasn't just bad for your soul, it was the root cause of injustice in the world. He saw that the demand for things like fancy dyed clothes or sugar was what fueled the slave trade and destroyed the land. He was connecting the dots between what we buy and the human and environmental cost. I mean, way ahead of his time. And just listen to this quote from him, written around 1770. That's more than 200 years before the first Earth Day. To impoverish the earth now to support outward greatness appears to be an injury to the succeeding age. He's talking about stealing from future generations. He's saying that using up the planet for our own stuff is basically robbing our grandkids. That is a full-blown sustainability ethic right there in the 1770s. Just incredible. But then, the Industrial Revolution kicks into gear, and the story gets a lot more complicated. See, those Quaker values of being honest and hardworking, they made them really, really good at business. And that success created this huge, difficult tension at the very heart of their beliefs. So on one hand, you have these famous Quaker industrialists, like the Cadbury family. Yep, the chocolate people. They built these amazing model towns for their workers, like Bournville, and made sure they were full of gardens and parks. They truly believed that giving people access to nature was crucial for their well-being. It was this idea of being a good steward, a caretaker. But here's the massive paradox. Those same families were also pioneers in ironworks, in railways, in chemical plants, literally the engines of the industrial age. So while they lived these simple lives personally, their businesses were helping to create the carbon-heavy, pollution-filled system we're dealing with today. It's what historians call a double culture, this deep contradiction right at the center of everything they were doing. Now, fast forward a bit, after two devastating world wars and the invention of the atomic bomb, that old industrial confidence really started to crumble. And for Quakers, this was a huge moment. It forced them to stop and completely rethink their relationship with the planet. And this is where a Quaker economist named Kenneth Boulding steps in. In 1966, he came up with a metaphor that completely changed the game. He said, we have to stop thinking of the Earth as this endless frontier we can just keep conquering. We have to see it for what it is, a closed system, a fragile, finite system, basically a spaceship. And his killer line was, you cannot have a war on a spaceship. That hits hard, doesn't it? So Boulding laid it out like this. We've been living in a cowboy economy, right? Just taking whatever we want, assuming there's always more over the next hill. But we have to switch to a spaceman economy. And on a spaceship, survival isn't about how much you can grab, it's about how well you can reuse, recycle, and regenerate everything within that closed system. This was a totally revolutionary idea that challenged, the very basics of modern economics. And that big economic idea led to a huge spiritual one. That old idea of stewardship, where humans are the responsible managers looking after nature, it started to feel, well, not quite right. A new idea started to take hold, kinship. The idea that we aren't managers of the Earth, we're members in it. We're part of the family, part of the crew on the spaceship, and we all depend on each other. It's a subtle difference in words, but a massive shift in thinking. Okay, so we've got this new mindset, this mix of spaceship economics and kinship with nature. So what does that look like in practice, right here and now? Well, in the 21st century, Quaker action has gotten really specific. First, they made those big global statements, like that Kabaric call we started with. Then, they started making commitments as an entire institution. In 2011, British Quakers basically promised to become a low-carbon community. And then came the big one. In 2013, they put their money where their mouth is. They became the very first church in the entire world to divest from fossil fuels, a huge, concrete step. So let's just zoom out and look at the whole 350-year story. You can really see how their focus just kept getting wider. It starts small, right, with George Fox and husbandry in the garden. Then it expands with John Woolman looking at our cumbers, our stuff. It gets complicated in the industrial era with the Cadburys and this idea of stewardship. Then, bam, it gets totally transformed by Kenneth Boulding and Spaceship Earth. And that brings us to today with thinkers like Therese Bach focusing on kinship and eco-justice. It's just an amazing step-by-step evolution of one core idea. And all of this leaves us with one last big question. For centuries, being a Quaker has meant living out these core commitments they call testimonies. Things like peace, equality, simplicity. They're non-negotiable. So after this incredible 350-year journey, from a simple garden all the way to Spaceship Earth, has Earth Care become the next great Quaker testimony? Is it now just as essential to their identity as all the others? When you look at what they're actually doing, it kind of seems like the answer is yes.